Welcome to Mind Set in Stone podcasts, where we dive deep into the most compelling books on the shelf. Join hosts Dave and Poppy as they uncover the stories, themes, and ideas that shape our understanding and inspire curiosity. Get ready to explore the big ideas that leave a lasting impact. Let's get started.
Ever feel like your brain's kind of running on a different operating system than everyone else's? Like you're getting different updates or something?
Totally.
We're diving deep into ADHD and AZ by Leanne Maskell today. And
Good one.
yeah, this book's going to help unpack that feeling.
It really does. And what's great is it's not just a boring clinical rundown, It's about real lived experiences straight from the source, someone who actually gets it.
And because it's written by someone with ADHD for people with ADHD, it just cuts right to the chase. It's relatable whether you've got ADHD yourself or maybe you're supporting someone who does.
Yeah, for sure.
One of the things I found so interesting was how the book tackles all these myths surrounding ADHD. Like you always hear, oh, it's a boy's disorder.
Right.
Turns out that is so far from the truth.
It's such a common misconception. And because of that, girls and women, they often get diagnosed way later in life because their symptoms aren't always as obvious. It's not always the classic disruptive in class kind of thing. It's more internal, It's the anxiety, feeling overwhelmed by just everyday stuff, struggling to stay organized, things that are easier to miss, or even misinterpret as something else entirely.
It makes you wonder how many people out there, especially women, were told they were just daydreamers or too sensitive when they were younger.
Oh, absolutely. Instead of getting the right support, and those misdiagnoses, they can have, pretty serious consequences down the road.
Yeah, that's what really struck me. Maskell mentions this study from the University of Toronto. 1 in 4 women with ADHD attempted suicide.
Yeah, it's a powerful statistic.
That is heavy stuff. And it really highlights that this isn't just about, forgetfulness or being easily distracted. This is about mental health at a much deeper level.
Definitely. And it kind of makes the book's focus on burnout really hit home even more, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. Because we live in a world that's constantly on, always buzzing, always demanding our attention. That's got to be even more intense for someone with ADHD.
Absolutely. Imagine your brain is like a television with every single channel on all at the same time.
Oh, wow.
That's kind of what it's like, trying to focus when you've got that constant noise and stimulation. It's exhausting.
And it's not just the external noise either, is it?
No, not at all.
Leanne Maskell, she talks about how ADHD brains, they crave novelty. So even when things seem calm on the outside, internally, there's this drive, this need for constant stimulation.
Yeah, it's like having this high-powered sports car engine.
Okay.
Stuck in a world that's built for, sedans.
I like that analogy.
To keep up, people with ADHD, they end up pushing themselves incredibly hard, often without even realizing it.
And just like a car running at max capacity all the time, eventually someone's got to give.
Exactly.
Which Maskell links to, a higher chance of burnout later in life, especially when no one recognizes that constant overexertion, and there's actually research on this back in 2016 by Ross that backs this up. It really makes you think, for someone listening right now, if you're struggling with that feeling of constant overwhelm, like you're always about to hit burnout mode, this could be a huge part of it.
It's definitely something to think about.
Definitely something to consider. But even with all these challenges, the book doesn't just dwell on the negative, it also highlights the strengths.
Oh, absolutely.
I love how Maskell talks about strength training.
Right. And she doesn't mean hitting the gym, although that can be super helpful too.
Right, exactly. So no, not that kind of strength training.
Exactly. It's about recognizing the flip side of those ADHD traits, the amazing upsides that often get overlooked.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Give us an example.
Okay, well, let's take that craving for novelty we just talked about. In the wrong job, the wrong environment, you can be completely overwhelming. But in a right career, it's pure gold.
I like that.
Maskell actually uses the example of firefighters.
Oh, that's a good one. Okay, yeah, I can see that. High pressure, constant change, you have to think on your feet. Those are all things where that ADHD energy could really be a good thing.
Precisely. It's not about fixing ADHD. It's about working with the way your brain is naturally wired. Find the environments where you can excel,
So instead of only focusing on what makes things harder, what makes life difficult, we need to figure out where those natural strengths can really shine.
Exactly.
And speaking of strengths, let's talk about one that everyone's curious about. Hyperfocus. It's like this superpower everyone wants to figure out.
It definitely feels like a superpower when you're in it, that's for sure. But just like any superpower, you got to learn how to harness it.
Right. Or it'll harness you.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's where the book is super helpful. It really breaks down how to work with hyperfocus, how to make it work for you instead of the other way around.
Okay, so how do we wrangle that kind of laser-like focus? Is there like a secret?
Well, remember that analogy earlier? The TV with all the channels blaring at once? Hyperfocus is like suddenly you lock onto one of those channels.
Yeah.
And it's so intense that everything else just fades away.
You're in the zone, but like times 1,000.
Yeah. And that can mean you get a ton of stuff done.
Right.
But it also means things like, eating, sleeping,
Oh, yeah.
taking care of yourself.
Right, yeah.
They all fall by the wayside. Finding that balance, that's the key.
Okay, so how do you strike that balance? How do you make hyperfocus work for you without it basically hijacking your whole day?
Well, one practical tip Maskell talks about is setting a timer. You work in focused sprints,
Yeah.
like 25 minutes on, 5 minutes off,
Yeah.
and repeat.
Wait, isn't that the Pomodoro technique? I've heard that's great for productivity in general, but I never connected it to ADHD.
It makes sense, though, right?
Yeah.
You're basically breaking down time into these, manageable chunks instead of letting the thought of a whole day just completely overwhelm you.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's like you're giving your brain permission to go all in on one task,
Yes.
but with some boundaries to keep it from going overboard.
Exactly. It's about working with your natural tendencies, not fighting against them.
I like it.
And, speaking of working with your tendencies, let's talk about relationships, because that's a huge part of it too, right?
Oh, yeah.
It's one thing for ADHD to affect how you manage your own life, your own to-do list,
Yeah.
but it also impacts the people closest to you.
Absolutely. It's not just how your brain works in isolation. It affects every single part of your life, especially your relationships with your partner, your friends, your family. And that's where, things can get really complicated. I mean, we've all had those moments in relationships where we feel like we're not quite on the same page.
Oh, tell me about it. Communication breakdowns are the worst.
Right. But what I found so interesting in the book was how ADHD can actually amplify those issues, especially when it comes to feeling rejected. Like really sensitive to it.
And it's actually more than just, being a little sensitive. The book talks about rejection-sensitive dysphoria, RSD.
RSD, okay. For anyone listening who's thinking, wait, what's the difference between that and just like taking things personally sometimes? What would you say?
It's like turning up the volume on those feelings, It's way more intense. RSD isn't just, oh, that kind of hurt my feelings. It's this huge, overwhelming emotional reaction. And often it's not even based on actual rejection. It's the perception of it.
So your brain is basically interpreting things as rejection, even if that wasn't the other person's intention at all.
Exactly. And that can show up in so many ways, right? You might withdraw from people, get super defensive, even lash out. And all that just creates more confusion and hurt, both for the person with RSD and everyone around them.
It's like a vicious cycle, right?
Yeah.
You feel rejected, so you react intensely. And that reaction might actually lead to more distance or conflict, which just reinforces that initial feeling of rejection.
Exactly. And that's why understanding RSD is so important. It's not a choice. It's not about being difficult on purpose. It's literally a neurological thing.
It's how your brain is wired.
And just knowing that can make a huge difference in how you approach your relationships.
So it's about having compassion, both for yourself and for the people in your life. Being open about what's going on, maybe even looking into therapy to develop coping mechanisms. I think that's huge. For anyone listening, have you noticed this in your own life? That intense reaction to even the hint of rejection. Because just being aware of it is a huge first step.
For sure. And the book also tackles another topic that can be kind of sensitive. Medication.
Yeah, there's definitely still a lot of stigma around ADHD medication, even though, like you said earlier, this is about mental health. And for some people, medication can be truly life-changing.
Right. It's like people are almost afraid to admit they might need that extra help. Like it's somehow a sign of weakness or failure.
Yeah, or like they're cheating somehow. But I love how honest Leanne Maskell is about her own experience with medication.
Oh, me too. She talks about how she was scared at first, which I think a lot of people can relate to. But then she found it so helpful. And I think that's such an important message. Because again, it's not about fixing someone,
It's about giving their brain the tools to work with them, not against them.
Exactly. It's like if you need glasses to see, you wear glasses, right?
Yeah.
It doesn't change who you are. It just helps you see more clearly.
I like that.
And that's what medication can do for some people with ADHD. Maskell talks about it like it helps you stop feeling like you're constantly swimming upstream.
Oh, wow, yeah.
You finally get to go with the flow.
That's a great way to put it. And speaking of swimming upstream, another area where I think a lot of us struggle, but especially people with ADHD, is time management. It can feel like a whole other beast.
100%. Our brains just don't always work in a way that, fits neatly into those little boxes on a calendar.
Right. So what does Maskell suggest? How do we even begin to tackle that?
Well, a lot of it goes back to working with your brain, not against it, right? Remember the Pomodoro technique we talked about? Those 25-minute work sprints?
Yeah, the timer thing. That makes a lot of sense for time management, too, when you think about it.
Right. It's like you're breaking those overwhelming tasks down into bite-sized pieces.
Instead of letting an entire day or even an hour just feel totally overwhelming.
And the book also talks about this idea of externalizing your tasks, which can be huge for ADHD brains.
Externalizing, okay, break that down for me. What does that look like in real life?
It's about getting all those to-dos out of your head and putting them somewhere you can actually see them, like physically see them.
Okay, so we're talking whiteboards, to-do lists, maybe even just sticky notes everywhere.
Exactly. Because out of sight, out of mind. Yeah. Right. If it's not staring you in the face, it's so easy for it to get lost in the shuffle.
Especially with a busy brain. And that's where having an accountability buddy can be really helpful too, I imagine. Someone to kind of gently nudge you in the right direction if you start to veer off track.
It's like having an external prefrontal cortex.
Love it.
Someone to provide that gentle structure and support.
Takes a village, right. And speaking of support, something else Maskell emphasizes is the importance of self-care for people with ADHD. Why is that so crucial, especially given everything we've talked about today?
Well, think about it. ADHD brains are often running at 100 miles an hour, right? All that energy, all that mental juggling, it takes a toll. If you're not taking care of yourself, burnout is pretty much inevitable.
It's like running a marathon every single day. You need to refuel, you need to rest.
And that's what self-care is all about, right? It's giving yourself permission to hit pause, to recharge, to fill your cup back up.
So important. So what are some ways to actually do that? What are some self-care strategies that really resonated with you from the book?
One that I actually started doing myself after reading about it is charging my phone in a different room at night.
Oh, the nighttime scroll. I am so guilty of that. But I can definitely see how, for someone with ADHD, that constant stimulation would make it even harder to wind down.
Exactly. And sleep is so important for managing ADHD symptoms. It's not just about feeling rested. It's about giving your brain that foundation it needs to function.
Honestly, that's good advice for all of us, ADHD or not. We underestimate the power of a good night's sleep.
It affects everything. And that's what Maskell really drives home. Self-care isn't selfish. It's essential. It's not indulgent. It's about giving yourself the tools to show up as the best version of yourself.
It really is about giving yourself what you need to thrive. And, there's one more thing in the book that I wanted to touch on before we wrap up. Maskell talks about ADHD and finances.
Oh, yeah, that's a big one.
Because those impulsive tendencies, that love of novelty we were talking about earlier, apparently it can sometimes lead to some interesting financial decisions.
Yeah, well, it makes sense, right? When you think about how the ADHD brain is wired, it's all about chasing that dopamine hit, that feeling of, ooh, something new.
Right.
And sometimes that translates into impulse purchases or maybe forgetting to pay those less than thrilling bills,
Yeah. It's like your brain sees a shiny new gadget and it's like, we need this, before you even have a chance to think about whether you can actually afford it.
Exactly. And it can have some real consequences. Maskell even cites some research on this. In 2022, Jones estimated that ADHD can cost individuals something like 1,600 pounds a year.
Wow.
Yeah. That's in things like late fees, overdraft charges. Those moments where you're like, oh, shoot, I totally forgot to pay that. It adds up.
So what can you do about it? If you know you have that tendency to make impulsive decisions, especially when it comes to spending, how do you get it under control?
Well, one thing Maskell talks about is making those impulse purchases harder to actually do. Because let's face it, we've all been sucked into those one-click online shopping experiences.
Oh, tell me about it. I have definitely bought things I did not need simply because it was just too easy to click that button.
Right. But for someone with ADHD, that can be really dangerous. So it's about creating some friction, some extra steps.
I like that. Make it harder to give in to those impulses.
Exactly. Maskell suggests things like maybe you block those tempting websites on your computer or unsubscribe from those flash sale emails that make your brain light up like a Christmas tree.
Yeah, those are dangerous.
Right. Or even just try using cash more often.
Interesting.
Because then you actually have to, like, physically hand over the money. It makes you think twice.
It's like you're forcing yourself to pause before you act on that initial impulse.
Exactly. Another tip I really liked was the idea of keeping a virtual shop. So basically, whenever you get that urge to buy something,
Especially something you weren't planning on buying.
yes, you write it down in this shop instead of immediately buying it.
So you're acknowledging the craving, but not necessarily giving into it.
Right. And a lot of times just the act of writing it down can be enough to satisfy that initial urge. Then, a few days later, you can look back at your list and be like, do I still actually want this?
I love that. Such a simple idea, but I bet it's really effective.
It's all about breaking those habits, those patterns.
Mm-hmm.
And then on a more practical level, Maskell's also a big fan of budgeting.
Okay, that makes sense. But sometimes, even the thought of creating a budget can feel overwhelming.
Oh, totally. But it's so worth it, you know?
Yeah.
Because for an ADHD brain, that thrives on spontaneity, having a plan, knowing where your money is going. It can be really empowering.
It's about taking control instead of feeling like you're constantly at the mercy of those impulses.
Exactly. The best part is, none of these strategies are about restriction. It's not about saying, oh, you can't have nice things or you have to live this super rigid life. It's about working with your brain to create a life that feels good.
A life that works for you.
Exactly.
I love that. Well, I think that's a perfect note to end on. This deep dive into ADHD. And AZ by Leanne Maskell has been so insightful, really eye-opening.
It's given us a lot to think about.
It really has. And for me, the biggest takeaway is that it's not about labeling or limiting people. It's about understanding. It's about embracing the fact that everyone's brain is wired a little differently. And that's okay.
It's not about fixing something that's broken. It's about celebrating those differences.
Absolutely. And for everyone listening, I hope this has sparked some new insights, maybe even a sense of hope. Because knowledge is power.
It really is. Remember, your journey is unique, your strengths are real, and there's a whole community out there rooting for you.
And if you're feeling inspired to learn more, we definitely recommend checking out ADHD, an AZ by Leanne Maskell. It's packed with even more insights and strategies. We couldn't even cover it all today.
It's a journey of self-discovery.
It really is. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep embracing the amazing uniqueness of your brain.
We hope you're leaving with fresh insights and a spark of inspiration. Remember to subscribe, leave a review, and check back for more episodes as we dive into new worlds of thought, one book at a time. Until then, keep your mind set in stone and your curiosity open. This has been a Big L Riz Media podcast, where big ideas meet lasting impressions.